Okay. So you've handed us this pile of executive orders, right? Hot off the presses from January 2025.
Straight from the Oval Office.
Yeah, and as always, what we do is we try to cut through the rhetoric and figure out,
Brass tacks.
what do these things actually do? What do they not do? Where's the fluff? Where's the hot air?
Yeah. Where's the showmanship?
Yeah, exactly. We're not here for the politics of it all.
Yeah.
We want to get down to the mechanics of how these things actually affect the government and the country. So let's just jump right into it. We've got a lot to cover today. We're looking at this Council to Assess the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the declassification of assassination records for JFK, RFK, and MLK Jr., emergency water measures for California, Hyde Amendment enforcement, federal recognition for the Lumbee tribe, the return of the Mexico City policy, a new science advisory council, removing barriers to AI leadership, beefing up digital finance leadership, and then we'll just briefly touch on this, the first 100 hours kind of brag sheet, just to get a sense of the context here, because this is a whirlwind start to an administration.
Yeah, they're boasting that they've signed more executive orders on day one than any other president. So talk about hitting the ground running.
Yeah, really trying to set the tone right out of the gate.
Absolutely. I think it speaks to the idea that they have a clear agenda and they want to make it known immediately. Yeah. What we have to look at is whether this speed leads to actual immediate change or whether it's simply kind of laying the groundwork for future shifts.
Right. Okay. So let's dive into that first one. The Council to Assess the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Now, on the surface, this sounds pretty benign, right?
Yeah.
It's a review council. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
But then you look a little closer, you see some of the language here, and you realize, okay, this isn't just a standard kind of, hey, let's check in on FEMA. They're specifically setting up this Federal Emergency Management Agency Review Council to advise the president on whether FEMA is doing its job well, and crucially, if it's being fair when responding to disasters.
And it's that issue of fairness that's really at the heart of this. What's so telling about this executive order is that they explicitly mention concerns over the Hurricane Helene response and even go so far as to accuse FEMA of political bias, citing a former FEMA responder who claims they were told to avoid homes of Trump supporters. So that's not just a casual concern, that's a direct accusation of impropriety.
Yeah, I mean, that's about as politically charged as you can get right there.
Absolutely.
And then they kind of hammer that home by saying that FEMA has diverted resources to missions beyond its scope and authority, specifically mentioning spending over $1 billion on welcoming illegal aliens. So again, they're really signaling right from the beginning here that this is a major concern of theirs.
Yeah.
And they're kind of setting the stage for potentially some pretty significant changes.
Yeah, so this council is specifically being created to look into these accusations, but also to evaluate FEMA's overall performance over the past 4 years. As you mentioned, it's going to be comprised of up to 20 members with the Secretaries of Homeland Security and Defense acting as co-chairs. Other members will include various agency heads and then some folks from outside the government who have expertise in disaster relief preparedness, natural disasters, federal-state relations, and budget management.
So they've got a pretty big task ahead of them.
Yeah.
They have to, assess whether FEMA has sufficient staffing, how FEMA's capabilities compare to state and local governments and private sector, examine the history of disaster relief in the U.S. before and after the creation of FEMA, evaluate whether FEMA's role should be supplemental to the states or if it should supplant state and local efforts in disaster response, and then ultimately you have to analyze all the different arguments for reforming FEMA and make recommendations to the president.
Right. And all of this has to be done on a relatively tight timeline. So they have to hold their first public meeting within 90 days of this order, and then they have 180 days after that first meeting to actually deliver their report to the president. So they have to hit the ground running.
Yeah. So what won't this do immediately? I mean, I think that's important to point out. It's not going to lead to any immediate changes in FEMA operations or policies, right? This is all about gathering information and making suggestions.
It's an advisory body.
Right. So the real impact of this will depend on what the president chooses to do after receiving that report.
That's the key takeaway here. This is an information gathering exercise. Any actual changes are still on the horizon.
And where's the potential for some empty promises or broad statements that don't really mean much? You see language in here about ensuring an impartial response and serving the national interest. But, those are pretty broad goals. Everyone says they want those things right. The real test is whether they come up with specific recommendations that actually address these concerns, and then whether the president actually implements those recommendations. Saying you want fairness is one thing. Actually making it happen is a whole other ballgame.
Absolutely. Agreed.
So that's the FEMA Council. Let's move on to something that I think is going to capture a lot of people's attention and imaginations. The declassification of records concerning the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You know, we're talking about some of the most significant events in American history and events that have been shrouded in mystery and controversy for decades.
Absolutely. Rife with conspiracy theories.
Right. So what does this executive order actually do? Well, it orders the full and complete release of all federal government records related to these assassinations.
And what's so striking about this is that they're really leaning into this idea of transparency.
Yeah.
You know, they acknowledge that not all of the records related to the JFK assassination were actually released by the 2017 deadline that was set by the 1992 JFK Records Act. And they point to the fact that previous presidents certified that releasing those records would harm national security interests. But this order basically says, we're done with that. We're not buying it anymore.
Yeah.
They flat out say that continued redaction is not consistent with the public interest and that the release of these records is long overdue. So it's a very strong statement.
Yeah, I mean, they're really playing into that deep public desire for answers,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And it's not just about JFK. They're also calling for a review of all records related to the RFK and MLK Jr. assassinations within 45 days. And that's even though there isn't a specific law mandating the release of those records. So that's a pretty bold move in terms of just saying, you know, we're going to be open about everything.
It is a very broad statement of commitment to transparency.
Yeah, so what does this order actually do? It directs the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General to come up with a plan within 15 days for the full release of the JFK records.
Hmm.
And then for the RFK and MLK Jr. records, they're ordering a review of all those records within 45 days, presumably, to determine, you know, which ones can be released and how they're going to go about releasing them.
Right, so there's still a process involved.
Right, so what won't happen immediately, we're not going to see a massive document dump, right?
No!
This is about setting a timeline for a plan to release the records.
It's setting the wheels in motion.
Right, the actual declassification and release of those documents will happen later according to that plan.
It's a promise of future action.
Right. And where's the potential for, you know, the hype to maybe exceed the reality? I mean, that strong language about transparency and seeking the truth,
Yeah.
that's powerful stuff. It definitely resonates with people. But the fact that they're doing this through a planned release suggests that they're going to be very deliberate and potentially cautious about what they actually release and when they release it.
Yeah, it allows for a phased approach and potentially for managing the flow of information.
Right. So, you know, we'll have to see what those records actually contain and how much they actually reveal. But it's definitely a story that we're going to be following very closely.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to something that has a little bit more immediate real-world implications, especially if you live in a certain part of the country. The emergency measures to provide water resources in California and improve disaster response in certain areas. And that's a mouthful of a title, but it gets at the heart of what they're trying to do here, which is address some really pressing issues related to water resources and disaster preparedness.
Yeah, and they don't mince words in this order. They come right out and mention the Los Angeles wildfires and the problem of dry fire hydrants and inadequate water infrastructure. So they're painting a picture of a very dire situation.
Yeah, and they're basically saying California has mismanaged its water resources and they're stepping in to fix it. So they're laying down a policy of providing Southern California with the water resources it needs, and they're saying they're going to do this, even if it means overriding state or local policies that they deem actively harmful. That's a pretty aggressive stance.
Yeah, it is. And they're not just talking about it. They're ordering a whole bunch of federal agencies to get involved. They're directing the Secretaries of Defense, the Attorney General, Homeland Security, Commerce, Interior, and Agriculture to ensure adequate water resources for Southern California. And they have 15 days to report back on what authority they have to do that.
And they're being very specific about how they want them to go about this. You know, they're directing the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Commerce to override existing activities that unduly burden efforts to maximize water deliveries. And they even specifically mentioned the no-action alternative of a Bureau of Reclamation environmental impact statement, which, for anyone who's not familiar with the jargon of environmental impact statements, basically means doing nothing. So they're saying, we don't want to do nothing. We want to actually take action to get more water flowing.
And they're really focusing on the Central Valley Project, which is this massive network of dams and canals that moves water around California. They're directing the Secretary of the Interior through the Bureau of Reclamation to use their discretion to deliver more water from the CVP, to increase storage and conveyance capacity, and to potentially jointly operate federal and state facilities, even if it contradicts state or local law.
I mean, that's a pretty clear signal that they're willing to go head-to-head with California on this issue.
Yeah. It is, and they're also taking aim at the Endangered Species Act, which is often cited as a barrier to increasing water deliveries. They're demanding expedited action on any ESA exemptions for the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. And they're even ordering the Secretary of the Interior to review, revise, or potentially rescind ESA implementation regulations. So they're really signaling that they're prioritizing water supply over environmental concerns.
Right, and it goes beyond just the water deliveries themselves. They're talking about identifying major water supply and storage projects, designating federal officials to coordinate compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, and they're even talking about suspending or revising regulations that they deem burdensome within 30 days. So it's a very broad and aggressive approach to basically taking control of California's water management.
It's a very assertive approach to federal power.
Yeah, and then beyond the broader water issues, they're also taking specific aim at how Los Angeles has responded to the wildfires and how it's used its federal preparedness grants. They're ordering HUD and FEMA to expedite housing relief options for wildfire survivors. They're directing the Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security through FEMA and the EPA to develop and execute a plan within 5 days to expedite bulk removal of contaminated debris. And they're even calling out Los Angeles specifically for not utilizing the majority of its federal preparedness grants, noting that the city has only used about $40 million of its $213 million allocation since fiscal year 2021.
And they go further by prohibiting the use of those grants to support what they call illegal aliens. And they're ordering the Attorney General, in conjunction with FEMA, to investigate Los Angeles for potential misuse of these grant funds. So it's a very targeted and potentially punitive action against the city.
Right, and then they also address the situation in North Carolina following Hurricane Helene. They're ordering the Secretaries of Transportation and Homeland Security through FEMA and the Small Business Administration to expedite roadway clearance and rebuilding efforts, including repairs to I-40 and private roads and bridges. And they're also directing HUD and FEMA to expedite housing relief options for Hurricane Helene survivors. So again, it's this emphasis on speed and efficiency and cutting through red tape.
Yeah, a focus on immediate action.
So what won't this executive order do immediately? Well, as with many of these, it won't lead to any immediate increase in water deliveries or infrastructure changes. Those things take time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the policy of overriding state policies, they could face some significant legal challenges.
Oh, yeah, California's not going to take this lying down.
Right. So we could see some pretty protracted legal battles over this.
Oh, absolutely.
And where's the potential for fluff or, kind of vague promises that don't really amount to much? Well, the statements about promoting sensible land management practices, those are pretty broad, right?
They are. And
Yeah.
it really depends on how you define sensible.
Right, and whether expediting processes actually leads to faster results on the ground, that remains to be seen. It'll depend on the specifics of how they actually implement these things. And then you have the accusations of California's mismanagement, which, that's very politically charged language.
Tough.
So that feels more like rhetoric than a concrete plan of action.
Yeah, it's about setting a tone and placing blame.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to another one that's very controversial. The enforcing the Hyde Amendment executive order. And for anyone who needs a refresher, the Hyde Amendment basically prohibits the use of federal funds to pay for abortions except in cases of rape incest or to save the life of the mother. And this has been a very contentious issue for decades, with Democrats generally opposing it and Republicans generally supporting it. So what does this executive order actually do? Well, it establishes a policy to end what they call the forced use of federal taxpayer dollars to fund or promote elective abortion. And it states that this policy is consistent with the Hyde Amendment. And they're also revoking 2 executive orders from 2022 that they say went against the Hyde Amendment. So this is really a direct reversal of the previous administration's policies on abortion funding.
Yeah, and it's very clear that they're trying to appeal to their base with this. They use very strong language accusing the previous administration of disregarding the Hyde Amendment and embedding taxpayer funding of elective abortions in various federal programs. So it's very much about framing this as a moral issue.
Right. So the main action in this executive order is directing the Director of the Office of Management Budget to issue guidance to all executive departments and agencies on how to implement this policy and to ensure that those 2 revoked executive orders are no longer in effect. So it's really about putting the OMB in charge of making sure that this policy is enforced across the entire federal government.
Right. So what won't this executive order do immediately? Well, it doesn't actually specify which programs are currently funding abortions or provide any details on what that OMB guidance will actually say. So the real impact on abortion access is going to depend on how broadly the OMB interprets this order and how aggressively it directs agencies to change their funding practices.
And where's the potential for fluff or, a rhetoric over substance? Well, the language about forced taxpayer funding, that's clearly meant to evoke a very strong emotional response from people who are opposed to abortion. But the actual effect on people's ability to access abortion services is going to depend on the specifics of how the OMB implements this policy. So we'll have to wait and see what that guidance actually says and how it's enforced.
Exactly. The devil is in the details.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's a little less contentious. The Memorandum on Federal Recognition of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. So this is about a specific Native American tribe that's been seeking full federal recognition for a very long time. So what does this memorandum do? Well, it establishes a policy to support full federal recognition for the Lumbee tribe, including all of the federal benefits that come with that status. And it highlights the long history of the Lumbee people, noting that they've been recognized by the state of North Carolina since 1885.
What's really interesting about this is that they point out that there was actually a federal law passed in 1956 called the Lumbee Act, which recognized the Lumbee people as Indians, but it specifically denied them federal benefits. So they've been in this kind of weird limbo for a long time where they're recognized, but they don't have access to the same resources and support as other federally recognized tribes.
Right. And the memorandum notes that the Lumbee tribe has over 55,000 members, making it the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River. And it mentions that the House of Representatives passed the Lumbee Fairness Act in 2024, which would have granted them full federal recognition, but it didn't pass the Senate. So this memorandum is basically saying we're going to try to get this done one way or another.
Yeah, it's a strong statement of support.
Right. So it directs the Secretary of the Interior to review all applicable authorities for tribal recognition, and within 90 days, submit a plan to the president to assist the Lumbee tribe in obtaining full federal recognition, whether that's through legislation or other mechanisms. And it specifies that the plan must consider legislative action, judicial action, and the existing procedures for federal acknowledgement of Indian tribes.
So they're really exploring all the options here.
Yeah, they're saying we're committed to this. We're
Yep.
going to find a way to make this happen. So what won't this memorandum do immediately? Well, it won't grant immediate federal recognition or benefits to the Lumbee tribe. This is about starting the process of figuring out how to get that done.
It's initiating a process.
Right. And where's the potential for things to maybe not go as smoothly as they hope? Well, the path to full federal recognition for tribes is complex. It can be very time-consuming and politically challenging. So while this memorandum is a positive step, it doesn't guarantee that they'll be successful. It'll depend on the specifics of the plan that the Secretary of the Interior comes up with and the political will to actually see it through.
Absolutely. The outcome is still uncertain.
Okay, so let's talk about another memorandum that has a lot of implications for international relations and global health policy, the Mexico City Policy Memorandum. And this policy has been a political football for decades. It basically says that U.S. foreign aid can't go to any non-governmental organization that provides abortion services or refers patients for abortions or even advocates for the legalization of abortion in their countries, and has been rescinded and reinstated by different presidents depending on their stance on abortion. So this memorandum reinstates the Mexico City policy, effectively reversing the previous administration's policy.
And it goes beyond just reinstating it. They're directing the Secretary of State in coordination with the Secretary of Health and Human Services to implement a plan to extend the requirements of the policy to all global health assistance furnished by all departments or agencies to the extent permitted by law. So they're really trying to broaden the reach of this policy.
Yeah, they're saying we want this to apply as broadly as possible. So what won't happen immediately? Well, we won't see a list of organizations that are losing funding right away. The Secretary of State has to develop an implementation plan, and it's not clear how far they'll be able to extend this policy to all global health assistance given potential legal limitations.
Right. So there's still some uncertainty about the scope of the implementation.
Right. And where's the potential for this to be more about making a political statement than having a precise and measurable impact? Well, the memorandum emphasizes preventing funding for coercive abortion or involuntary sterilization, which aligns with the stated purpose of the Mexico City policy. But critics argue that it often has a much broader impact, limiting access to a wide range of reproductive health services, including family planning and contraception. So how they define support or participate in abortion-related activities could be very broad and could affect organizations that provide essential health services to women and families around the world.
Yeah, that's a common criticism of the policy, that it has unintended consequences.
Okay, let's dive into the world of science and technology. The President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCST Executive Order.
Hmm.
So this is about creating a new council to advise the president on all things science and tech, right?
Exactly. And they're revoking the previous PCSD, which was established in 2021. So again, we see this pattern of undoing what the previous administration did.
Right. And they lay out their vision for what this new PCST will focus on. They say its purpose is to advise the president on scientific, technological education and innovation policy, and to provide scientific and technical information related to a whole range of issues, including the economy, national security, homeland security, public health, and environmental protection.
And they're very explicit about wanting to maintain what they call unquestioned and unchallenged global technological dominance for the United States, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology. So that's a pretty ambitious goal.
Yeah, and they're not shying away from controversy here either. They express concern about what they call ideological dogmas in science, that they say elevate group identity over individual achievement and inject politics into the scientific method, which they claim erodes public trust and stifles innovation. So that's a pretty direct critique of certain viewpoints within the scientific community.
It is, and it's likely to be met with pushback from some quarters. Right. So how will this new PCS actually work? Well, it'll have up to 24 members, including the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and the Special Advisor for AI and Crypto, who will serve as co-chairs. And then the other members will be appointed by the President, and they'll come from academia, industry, and the government. So they're trying to get a broad range of perspectives here.
And they'll be advising the president on a whole range of issues, as we mentioned earlier, but they'll also be serving as advisory committees for two specific national initiatives: the National High Performance Computing Initiative and the National Nanotechnology Initiative. So they'll have a pretty big portfolio.
Yeah, so what won't happen immediately? Well, we don't know who those 24 members are going to be yet. And it's not clear what their immediate priorities will be. So the real influence of this council will depend on who's appointed and what issues they choose to focus on.
Right. It's all about who's at the table and what they decide to talk about.
Okay.
And where's the potential for empty promises or broad statements that don't translate into concrete action? Well, the emphasis on global technological dominance and the critique of ideological dogmas, those are pretty broad themes, right?
They are, and they could be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Right. So we'll have to see how that translates into specific policy recommendations and actions.
The true measure will be in the outcomes.
Okay, so sticking with technology, let's look at the executive order on removing barriers to American leadership in artificial intelligence. And this really builds on that theme of global technological dominance that we were just talking about.
Absolutely. They're making it very clear that they see AI as a crucial area for U.S. leadership, and they want to make sure that nothing is holding the country back.
Right, so they're establishing a policy to sustain and enhance America's global AI dominance, and they're specifically calling for AI development that's free from ideological bias or engineered social agendas. And they're also revoking a previous executive order from 2023 that presumably took a different approach to AI development. So again, we see this pattern of reversing course from the previous administration.
Yeah, it's a very clear signal that they're taking a different approach.
So what are the main actions in this order? Well, they're directing the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology, the Special Advisor for AI and Crypto, and the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs to develop a national AI action plan within 180 days. And they're ordering an immediate review of all policies and actions taken under that revoked executive order to identify anything that's inconsistent with this new policy. And agencies are directed to suspend, revise, or rescind any such actions or propose to do so. And they can get an exemption if they can't finalize those actions immediately.
So it's a pretty aggressive timeline for making these changes.
Yeah, they're not wasting any time. And then they're also directing the OMB to revise two existing memoranda, M2410 and M2418, within 60 days to make sure they align with this new AI policy. So it's really about making sure that the entire federal bureaucracy is on board with this new approach.
It's about top-down policy alignment.
Right. So what won't this executive order do immediately? Well, it doesn't actually specify which aspects of the previous AI executive order they consider to be barriers or ideologically biased. So the impact of this order will really depend on what they find in that review and what they include in the new AI action plan and those revised OMB memoranda.
Right. It sets a new direction, but the specifics are still to be determined.
And where's the potential for fluff or vague pronouncements? Well, that focus on AI being free from ideological bias, that's a really key theme here. But what does that actually mean in practice? How do you define ideological bias in the context of AI development? It's a very subjective and potentially slippery concept. So it'll be interesting to see how they try to operationalize that.
Yeah, it's a noble goal, but a very tricky one to achieve.
All right. Okay, last but not least, we have the executive order on strengthening American leadership in digital financial technology. And this one deals with the very rapidly evolving world of cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, and digital assets in general.
And they're coming out strong on this one. They're establishing policies to promote U.S. leadership in these areas, and they're really emphasizing the importance of protecting economic liberty and individual freedom in the context of this new technology.
Right. So they're outlining a whole range of policy goals here, including supporting responsible growth of digital assets, blockchain technology, and related technologies, protecting the ability of individuals and entities to access and use open public blockchain networks for lawful purposes without persecution, including the ability to self-custody their digital assets, protecting the sovereignty of the U.S. dollar, including promoting the use of dollar-backed stablecoins, promoting fair and open access to banking services for all law-abiding individuals and entities, and calling for regulatory clarity and certainty based on technology-neutral regulations.
It's a very comprehensive approach.
Yeah, and they're also taking a very clear stance against central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. They're prohibiting any actions to establish, issue, or promote a CBDC in the U.S., and they're directing the termination of any ongoing CBDC planning activities. So they're basically saying we're not going down that road.
It's a very definitive statement against CBDCs.
And to really drive this point home, they're creating a new entity called the President's Working Group on Digital Asset Markets, which will be chaired by this special advisor for AI and crypto. And this working group will include representatives from a whole bunch of key agencies, including the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, Homeland Security, Commerce, Labor, State, and Defense, as well as the Office of Management and Budget, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the Office of the Controller of the Currency.
So they're really bringing in all the heavy hitters on this one.
Right? They're not messing around.
Right.
And what is this working group going to do? Well, they have 30 days to identify all regulations and guidance that affect the digital asset sector, 60 days to recommend whether to rescind or modify those regulations and guidance, and then 180 days to submit a report to the president with proposed regulatory and legislative actions. So it's a very ambitious timeline for developing a new regulatory framework for digital assets.
They're moving quickly to establish a new set of rules for this space.
Right. And some of the key areas they're going to be looking at include establishing a federal regulatory framework for digital assets, including stablecoins, and evaluating the potential for creating a national digital asset stockpile, potentially from seized cryptocurrencies. So that's an interesting idea that we haven't heard much about before.
It is. It suggests a willingness to really embrace the potential of digital assets.
So what won't this executive order do immediately? Well, it doesn't create any new regulations for the digital asset space right away. That's going to take some time. But it does set the stage for those future regulations, and it orders a review of existing regulations. And the prohibition on developing a CBDC that is immediate. So that's a very concrete action.
Yeah, it's a clear statement of where they stand on that issue.
Right. And where's the potential for fluff or, big promises that don't necessarily translate into action? Well, the emphasis on responsible growth and economic liberty, those are pretty broad principles that could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So the real impact of this executive order will depend on what specific regulations they come up with. And that idea of a national digital asset stockpile, that's very intriguing. But there are no concrete details on how that would actually work yet. So it's something to watch, but it's still very early stages.
Absolutely. It's a vision for the future, but the details are still blurry.
So as we look back at all of these executive actions from the first few days of this new administration, I think some clear themes emerge. First, there's a very strong focus on reviewing and potentially reversing policies from the previous administration. Second, They're creating a lot of new advisory bodies, councils, and working groups to provide guidance and recommendations on a wide range of issues. Third, they're taking a very active role in addressing disaster-related issues, particularly when it comes to water resources. And fourth, they're laying out new policy directions in areas like technology, digital finance, and social issues that are likely to have significant long-term consequences.
And what's really striking is the speed and the volume of these actions. It's a very aggressive start to an administration, and it suggests a real sense of urgency to get things done.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that many of these executive orders are really just the beginning of a process. They're setting up reviews, demanding plans and reports, and initiating investigations. So the real impact of these actions is going to unfold over the coming weeks and months as those processes play out.
Absolutely. It's all about setting the wheels in motion.
And I think it's also worth noting that many of these topics are very politically charged. We're talking about accusations of political bias at FEMA, the enduring mysteries of those assassinations, the urgent need for water resources in California, the deeply divisive issue of abortion funding, and the debates over ideology in AI and the future of digital currencies. So these executive orders aren't just about bureaucratic procedures. They're tapping into some very strong emotions and deeply held beliefs.
Yeah, they're touching on some of the most fundamental issues facing the country.
Right. So for all of you listening out there, what are the one or two areas that you're going to be watching most closely? What do you think the long-term consequences of these initial actions might be? We've only scratched the surface here, and there's a lot more to unpack as these stories continue to develop. But hopefully this has given you a good starting point for understanding what these executive orders actually do, what they don't do, and what they might mean for the future of the country. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for having me.